Elijah Cross was dragged into court like a criminal cuffed accused, surrounded by people who had already made up their minds. The cop screamed. The judge turned cold. No one asked who he really was. They just saw a black man in trouble. But beneath that quiet stare was a Navy SEAL with nothing left to lose. What happens when a courtroom mistakes a war hero for a threat? If this story speaks to you, like, share, and subscribe to Echo Blind. Now let's go back to where it all began. They brought him in like he was already guilty. Elijah Cross, tall and broad-shouldered, walked through the double doors of the courtroom with his wrists cuffed tightly in front of him. His head was up, but his eyes didn't move. Not toward the crowd, not toward the bench, not even toward the 3 officers flanking him like he was a bomb that might go off if left unattended. He didn't flinch when the murmurs started. He didn't blink when the officer beside him, Travis Harlan badge polished to perfection, chin held too high for someone so wrong, grinned, like this was just another performance. But I remember the look. Not on Elijah's face. No. Elijah's face stayed still. It was the judge, Judge Robert Greeley. When Elijah crossed that threshold, Greeley didn't just glance up. He paused, blinked, then leaned ever so slightly forward, like the sight of this particular black man had disturbed something in his neat little script. But then, just as quickly, he reset, lifted the file, flattened his expression, read like nothing about this moment required more than 5 minutes of his attention. Mr. Elijah Cross. He began, tone dry as paper. You stand accused of resisting arrest, inciting public disorder, and attempting to cause harm to an officer of the law. Elijah opened his mouth, not wide, not sudden, just enough to speak. His voice was low, cracking at the edges. Please, just check the footage. Not a demand, not defiance, just a plea. But Harlan laughed loudly, deliberately, and without shame. That kind of laugh meant to tell the room who was really in charge here. Oh, he wants the footage, Harlan said, turning to the courtroom like it was a comedy club. That's a new one. I guess now resisting arrest on Main Street is just a misunderstanding. Maybe next he'll say I tripped and cuffed myself. A few people chuckled. Not many, but enough. And Greeley. He didn't say a word. Didn't reprimand the officer. Didn't ask Elijah to clarify. Didn't ask for the footage either. Just kept reading like he hadn't heard anything. That's when I knew. This wasn't a trial. This was theater. A script that had already been written. Elijah was standing there bound and silent, not because he was dangerous, but because someone had already decided what kind of man he was. And in this courtroom in that town on that morning, a black man in handcuffs didn't need a record. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need a reason. His skin was enough. And yet the irony, the bitter, bone-deep irony, was that the man they dragged in like a threat had once been trained to protect the very people now pretending not to see him. But nobody in that room knew that yet. Not the judge, not the prosecutor. Certainly not Officer Travis Harlan, who was still enjoying his spotlight like he'd already won. Only Elijah knew what was coming. And I swear if you looked closely just beneath the calm behind the quiet, you could almost see it. Not fear, not anger, just a kind of waiting, as if he knew they'd just made a mistake they couldn't walk back. And that's how it all began. It didn't take long for the shouting to start. The moment the prosecutor stepped aside and gave the floor to Officer Travis Harlan, the energy in the room changed. Not like tension rising in silence. No, it was sharper than that. Like someone had turned up the volume before the story even began. Harlan stood there full uniform, chin up, voice ready, like this was less about testimony and more about a performance. And then he let loose. This man, he barked. Pointing directly at Elijah, refused to comply when I gave him a lawful command. He became physically agitated, verbally combative. I had reason to believe he was escalating. I was outnumbered. I had to act quickly. He said it loud enough to shake the back row, loud enough for the reporters to glance up from their notepads, loud enough that no one noticed Elijah's lips moving softly, deliberately, as if trying to speak through the storm. You grabbed me, I begged you to stop. That's all he said. Barely above a whisper. Not a protest, not a tantrum, just a fact. A sentence no one asked for, and no one heard. Harlan kept going, layering accusation on top of accusation, words chosen not for truth, but for impact. He tensed his shoulders. He stared me down. His posture was aggressive. I feared for my safety. "He fits the profile of—" "Keep it brief," Officer Greeley said, not looking up from his paperwork. "Not a word about tone. Not a word about restraint. Just that. Keep it brief." Like none of this deserved to be slowed down. Like Elijah's name, his story, his breath, it was all an inconvenience on the docket. I looked back at Elijah then. He wasn't blinking as much anymore, just watching, listening, not because he agreed, not because he accepted it, but because he realized something in that moment. No one in that room had come to hear him. His voice, no matter how careful, no matter how measured, would always sound like a threat to people who'd already made up their minds. So he said nothing more. He stood still, not like a statue, but like someone who knew the difference between silence and surrender. And as Harlan wrapped up his statement smug and satisfied, something strange happened. A little girl sitting near the back, maybe 9 or 10 years old, leaned sideways in her mother's lap. She looked directly at Elijah. She didn't smile. She didn't look scared either. She just looked, long and steady, like she saw something no one else was paying attention to. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pity. It was something in between. The kind of gaze that made you wonder what the world looks like through eyes that small when justice already feels like it belongs to somebody else. And Elijah, he didn't look away. Not from her, not from the judge, not even from Harlan. He just breathed once deep and stayed right where he was. And that breath, that single breath, carried more dignity than anything else spoken in that room. It didn't take long for the shouting to start. The moment Officer Travis Harlan was called to speak, something shifted in the air. It wasn't quiet tension. It was louder than that, like a warning siren disguised as confidence. He stepped forward like a man on a mission not to explain but to accuse, and his voice didn't shake. It cut through the courtroom. "This man," he said, jabbing his finger at Elijah, refused to follow a direct order. He stared me down. He became agitated, unpredictable. I feared for my safety. He fit the profile. That word profile hung in the air longer than it should have. It wasn't the first time someone like Harlan used it that way. It wouldn't be the last. Elijah stood still, wrists still cuffed, but his jaw moved ever so slightly, and then his voice followed low, steady, full of restraint. "You grabbed me. I begged you to stop." But no one listened. Harlan kept going faster now, layering accusation on top of implication, creating a picture for people who didn't want details, just something simple to believe. I acted within protocol. He escalated the situation. I gave every warning required. He left me no choice. And then came the only interruption, cold and practiced. "Keep it brief," Officer Judge Greeley said, barely lifting his head. Not a word about the officer's tone. Not a question about Elijah's version of events. Not even a glance to acknowledge that a man in handcuffs had just whispered about being hurt. Just another box to check before moving on. I watched Elijah in that moment. His lips didn't part again. His eyes stopped scanning the room. Something in him went still, not like surrender, but like understanding. That's when it clicked. He realized this wasn't a place where his words mattered. No one here had come to listen. And when a man knows that when he's measured every word before speaking and still been ignored, silence becomes less a weakness and more a kind of shield. He stood there, wrapped in that silence, as Harlan smirked through the end of his statement, satisfied that the room was his. And then something quiet happened. In the back of the room, a little black girl, maybe 9 or 10, shifted in her seat beside her mother. She leaned out just enough to see around the person in front of her and looked straight at Elijah. Not scared, not confused, just looking. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pity either. It was something in between, a quiet recognition. And Elijah met her eyes, just for a second. He didn't nod, didn't smile, he just looked back. And in that simple exchange, something softened. Not in the courtroom, not in the judge, not in the officer, but in the space between one man who'd been silenced and one child who chose to see him anyway. And sometimes that's enough to keep standing. Even when the world's already decided you don't get a voice. The truth came in pieces, just not the right ones. When the prosecution wheeled in the monitor and played the footage, there was a shift in the room. People leaned forward. Reporters raised their pens, all eyes on the screen. But the moment it started, you could feel it. Something was wrong. The video picked up mid-incident. The audio crackled. Elijah's face was already tense, his arms already half raised. His voice cut off. No context, no beginning. just a black man caught in a still frame of resistance. This, the prosecutor said confidently, shows the defendant engaging in aggressive behavior toward Officer Harlan. Pay close attention to his body language. Shoulders stiff, fists clenched, advancing. The room stayed quiet, not because they believed it, but because the image did the talking. And in court, an image like that can be louder than any truth. Elijah shifted in his seat. Not much. Just enough to breathe differently. His lawyer, a young man with tired eyes and a suit a half size too big, leaned over and whispered just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Don't interrupt. Let them finish. We'll respond after. But there was no response that could undo what had just been shown. Because the next weapon wasn't visual, it was verbal. The prosecutor moved to the next tactic. Now, the defendant's background he began as if reading off a grocery list. No current employment. No fixed residence on record for 5 of the last 8 years. No tax filings during that same period. A history of prolonged absences and no documented professional references. He let it hang for a moment. Long enough for people to draw conclusions. Long enough to smear someone without ever saying the words. It was character assassination dressed in legal procedure. Elijah turned his head slightly, but he didn't look at the jury. He looked down. His hands were folded tight. His right thumb ran slow circles against the palm of his left hand, like he was counting breaths. Like he was remembering something. Then his fingers tightened and the faint glint of silver caught the light. The ring. It was small, worn, but unmistakable. A silver Navy SEAL trident, pressed into the surface like a memory you can't erase. Not flashy. Not something he ever showed off. But now it caught the light just enough to be seen. And just long enough for him to feel the weight of everything it stood for. Years of silence. Years of sacrifice. Missions no one would ever read about. Service buried under clearance codes and locked files. And now none of it mattered. Not to the court. Not to the file. Not to the man in the black robe sitting with arms crossed, eyes dull. Judge Greeley waited until the prosecutor finished, then turned to Elijah's lawyer and asked plainly, "Any rebuttal?" The lawyer hesitated, opened his mouth, closed it, then stood up trying to keep his voice even. "Your Honor, we would request the court consider the full context of the footage. We also intend to submit character statements and service documentation." Greeley didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look up. "This court doesn't judge sentiment," he said. And just like that, it was over. A life of service reduced to a gap in employment. A man's dignity reframed as a liability. Truth trimmed and muted, made to fit the frame of someone else's story. Elijah didn't speak again, but in that silence he wasn't empty. He was boiling. Not reckless, not loud, just aware, painfully aware that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way it was meant to, and he had just become its latest example. The courtroom had gone quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the kind that settles in after weariness when everyone starts assuming the worst has already happened. Then a voice rose gentle but firm. "I request to testify, Your Honor." It came from an older black woman seated near the back. She stood slowly adjusting the brim of her blue hat as she looked straight ahead. "My name is Martha Jameson. I live on 7th and Bay. I witnessed the arrest. I saw everything." She didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She didn't plead. She simply offered herself as a witness, as if doing anything less would have betrayed what she knew to be right. For a moment, no one moved. Then Judge Greeley shifted in his chair. He didn't look at her right away. He just sighed and glanced briefly toward the clerk, then spoke with that familiar chill in his tone. "Mrs. Jameson, this is not the time for unsolicited testimony. The procedure is in place for a reason. If you wish to submit a statement, do so through the proper legal channel." She didn't sit down. "I submitted it. Days ago," she said without raising her voice. "No one returned my calls. No one followed up. So I came." Still, she was standing steady, respectful, but unflinching. She looked at Elijah as she said the next part. "You didn't resist," she said softly. "You asked him to stop. I remember. Because I remember the look on your face when he didn't." And in that moment, Elijah looked up. Not all the way, just enough to meet her eyes. Something flickered there, too faint to name. Maybe gratitude. Maybe grief. Maybe the ache of being seen after being made invisible. But it didn't last long. Greeley tapped the desk with 2 fingers. "This courtroom cannot accommodate personal accounts without verification. Please take your seat, ma'am." The bailiff approached, not hostile, but present enough to send a signal. Mrs. Jameson sat. Her back remained straight. Her eyes did not drop. Then a younger man stood beside her, clean-shaven, shoulders squared, holding a small black USB in his hand. My name's Ben Jameson. That's my mother. He raised the drive just slightly. This contains the footage from the street camera on Bay. The original file, time-stamped. No edits. It shows the whole interaction start to finish. He stepped forward, offering the drive toward the bailiff. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a small rebellion against the silence in the room. We sent this to the precinct. No one replied. We left messages. No one called back. We figured if no one wanted to come for the truth, we'd bring it here ourselves. The drive exchanged hands. The court reporter glanced up for a second. So did a couple of jurors. But the judge, he barely moved. It will be reviewed, Greeley said with practiced neutrality. Eventually, one word. One pause. Enough to flatten everything that had just happened. Ben didn't argue. He nodded once, jaw locked tight, and returned to his seat. And that was it. The truth had arrived, delivered calmly, offered freely, and dismissed like a catalog envelope. Elijah hadn't moved, but I noticed the way his body responded. A shift in breath. A quiet exhale. His shoulders didn't slump, but something in them settled lower. He looked down at the floor as if counting the tiles, or avoiding something he didn't want to show. Because hope, when it's crushed twice in the same hour, doesn't fall apart loudly. It folds inward, quietly, completely. For a split second, it almost looked like he might speak, like he wanted to say thank you, or scream, or demand the judge look him in the eye. But then his hand slid to the edge of the table, knuckles tightening just slightly, and the moment passed. He wasn't silent because he had nothing left. He was silent because he was choosing to watch every word, every move, every delay. Not out of fear. Not anymore, but out of clarity. And in that space, something inside him began to shift, not with panic, but with precision. Because when the truth is turned away at the door, some people break. And some just start planning how to come back through the window. No one expected the screen to flicker on that early. Maybe it was the clerk. Maybe someone had queued it up already, waiting for permission that never came. But suddenly, the courtroom dimmed, the lights over the jury box softened, and the video began to play. No music, no effects, just a timestamp at the bottom left, 4:47 p.m. Camera angle high, looking down at the corner of Bay and 7th. Elijah was there, alone, not moving fast, just walking. And then from the edge of the frame, a patrol cruiser pulled up. Travis Harlan stepped out wide stance, one hand already resting on the holster at his side. He didn't speak first. Elijah did. The courtroom heard it. "Sir, I serve this country. Please don't do this." That was it. No shouting, no threats. Just a man in a gray hoodie with his hands open, not raised, just open. Then the camera caught it. Travis grabbing Elijah's arm, twisting, pushing. Elijah stumbling backward into the hood of the car. A knee pressed into his back. Handcuffs clicked. The audio picked up Elijah again, quiet, almost a whisper. "I didn't do anything. I just needed to cross the street." Then silence. The video froze. The clerk hit pause, but no one moved. Not the jury. Not the people in the gallery. Not even Travis. The entire courtroom sat still, like the moment had vacuumed the air out of the walls. And then slowly one man stood. He was in the back row. White hair, dark coat chest, full of old medals pinned across his left side. He took off his cap, something military worn and folded, and with no words, no signal, he held it to his chest and nodded toward Elijah. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't performative, it was respect. And that respect didn't need explaining. Elijah didn't turn to look. He didn't acknowledge it. But I saw his fingers shift slightly, the way someone steadies their breath without drawing attention to it. Travis moved. Not far, but enough. His hands fidgeted near his belt. His mouth opened, slightly closed again, then opened once more. That's not the full "there was more" before the tape started. He was aggressive. No one answered. Not even Judge Greeley, who had been scribbling something on a yellow notepad. The judge finally looked up, tapped the gavel once, not loud, just enough to break the tension. "Footage acknowledged," he said. "Let's move forward." Move forward. The words hung there too light for what had just happened. But the courtroom didn't push back. Because the system never reacts to shame. It absorbs it. And still something had changed. The jury wasn't breathing the same. The audience wasn't blinking as fast. Even the bailiff's stance had softened by a fraction. Elijah didn't smile. But the weight in his shoulders began to redistribute. Not lifted, just reorganized. Because when a lie has held the floor for too long, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just has to show up. And in that moment it had. Without force, without spectacle, just a single screen. A quiet plea. And the eyes of a room finally forced to see. The mood in the courtroom had shifted, but the system hadn't. After the video played, people expected the prosecution to retreat to regroup, maybe even recalibrate. But instead they doubled down. The assistant district attorney stood with a small stack of papers in his hand, voice measured almost smug. "There's more to Mr. Cross than a calm demeanor and an edited clip," he said, walking slowly past the jury box. According to military records, he was investigated during his time of service. Nothing formally charged, but enough to raise questions about his stability, about his judgment. There was no gasp, no interruption. Just that kind of collective tightening that happens when someone throws dirt softly, strategically onto something sacred. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't blink. But the courtroom felt it, how the prosecution didn't have to disprove his honor. They just had to stain it a little. Enough for doubt to grow. His lawyer stood, objected quietly, and then leaned toward the bench. "Your Honor, the defendant's military history is not only commendable, it's crucial to understanding the context of this arrest." Greeley didn't hesitate. He tapped his pen against the wood and responded without emotion. "Military background is irrelevant here. This is a civilian matter." He said it like a mechanic declining to check the engine because the tires looked fine. Elijah remained silent. He hadn't spoken since the video, not a word, but his presence was growing louder by the minute. Later that afternoon, after a brief recess, he asked for pen and paper. He didn't say what he was writing. No one asked. He just folded the letter twice, slid it into an envelope, and handed it to the court officer with a quiet nod. We didn't know who it was for. Not yet. But something in the way he sealed it carefully, deliberately, made it feel like more than a message. It felt like a signal. By then, the gallery had stopped whispering. They weren't sure what to do with him anymore. He didn't play the part of a wronged man seeking pity. He wasn't pleading, wasn't exploding, wasn't trying to earn anyone's sympathy. He just sat, head high, eyes steady, and the stillness strangely began to fill the room more than the shouting ever had. It wasn't defeat. It was calculation. Like someone who knew the war wasn't lost, it was simply changing terrain. At one point, the judge asked him directly if he wished to testify on his own behalf. Elijah paused, then shook his head once. It was not the reaction of someone with nothing left to say. It was the restraint of a man waiting for something bigger to speak for him. He wasn't clinging to dignity anymore. He was building something beneath it, quietly, intentionally. Some in the room mistook it for surrender, but just a few began to wonder, what kind of man chooses to hold the truth this long, unless he knows exactly when to release it? And just like that, the storm settled, not because it was over, but because the eye had passed. And what came next would be bigger than any of them were prepared to face. They heard the door before they saw the man, not the usual courtroom door. The heavy one at the side, the one almost no one used, unless they were wearing a badge or answering a subpoena. It creaked open without fanfare, and then the air changed. He didn't rush, he didn't speak. He just walked forward, boots polished, metals glinting, and the kind of silence trailing behind him that only belonged to men who had nothing left to prove. General Wallace Grant. The courtroom didn't know whether to rise. The judge didn't call a recess. The bailiff didn't block him. Because authority, when earned, doesn't wait for permission. He didn't even look at the bench when he spoke. His eyes were fixed on Travis. "I've seen men hold guns with less fear than the way you're holding your silence right now," he said. Calm, but cutting. "You screamed at a Navy SEAL in a public courtroom. Tell me, officer, was that about justice or was it about control?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Travis didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened, but all that came out was the shifting weight of someone realizing the room was no longer on his side. General Grant turned to the judge. "I'm not here to ask for leniency. I'm here because a courtroom that turns its back on the truth deserves to see what it's ignoring." He took out a document. 1 page, not a speech. A classified mission record, its redactions thick, but one name clearly visible. Elijah Cross. He laid it on the prosecution's table like a challenge. 6 soldiers left bleeding on the floor of Kandahar, under fire, no backup, no extraction plan. He brought them all back. You're looking at a man who bled to keep this country's promises. And now you've dragged him in here chained like a threat. He looked at Greeley. "You think this is about law? It's not. This is about who you become when the law no longer serves justice. Still no one moved. No objections, no gavel. Greeley just stared at the desk, as if it might open and swallow the shame beneath his robe. Grant stepped closer to Travis, his voice slicing through the tension. If you were under fire pinned down in the sand, would you trust this man to come for you? He pointed to Elijah, still silent, still seated. Would you follow him into a kill zone, officer? Travis flinched. Because I did. A long pause. And I'm standing here because of him. The gallery shifted, the weight of that statement settling deep. Even the jury, who'd been told to look only at evidence, couldn't pretend anymore that this man was a stranger. General Grant turned back to Elijah. You didn't call me. You didn't ask for help. That letter you sent, it didn't beg. It reminded me of who you are, of who I became because of you. He placed the letter gently beside Elijah's hand. And for the first time in that trial, Elijah moved with purpose. Not grandly, not with anger, just a quiet, steady curl of his fingers around that page. Not a single word left his lips, but the message was clear. He didn't need to speak, because now, finally, the room was listening. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply exhaled. The kind of breath you take after holding it for far too long. The kind that feels like survival. The bailiff, who only an hour ago had yanked Elijah Cross forward like a threat in chains, now moved with caution. His fingers fumbled slightly as he reached for the cuffs. No one rushed him. The clink of metal echoed louder than any gavel. The cuffs fell away not as a gift, not as mercy, but as the correction of a wrong too obvious to ignore. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even look down. He stood still while the courtroom shifted quiet, unsure, almost embarrassed by its own complicity. Judge Greeley didn't lift his head. Instead, he signed something with a stiff hand, barely meeting anyone's gaze. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't try to reclaim control. He just pushed the paper forward, flat and final. All charges dismissed. That was it. No explanation, no rationale. Because in the presence of undeniable truth, even the system knows when it can no longer pretend. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood the way people do when they know they've been carrying weight no one else could see. He gathered nothing, no briefcase, no folder, because they'd never given him anything except shame and suspicion. He just turned his back, straight eyes moving slowly across the room that once condemned him without asking who he was. And that's when the first voice broke the silence. From behind the gallery barrier, a reporter raised her mic. She looked no older than 30, her press badge swinging nervously from her neck. Mr. Cross? Why didn't you tell us who you were? She asked, her voice clear, almost desperate. He paused. The question wasn't cruel, it was the kind asked by someone realizing they'd missed something vital. That maybe they'd been part of the problem. Elijah turned toward her. Not abruptly, not with any fire, but with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't come from titles or uniforms. Because if I need a uniform to be heard, he said slowly, then I was never heard at all. And there it was. A sentence so simple yet so sharp it cut through every presumption that had filled that courtroom since the trial began. People shifted in their seats. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked at Elijah like they were seeing him for the very first time. No one applauded, because it wasn't a moment built for performance, it was a reckoning. As Elijah walked toward the door, his footsteps sounded different than when he'd first entered in chains. Now they echoed with freedom hard-earned, not gifted. Just before he reached the threshold, something soft brushed against his arm. He looked down. It was the little girl, the one who had been sitting beside her mother all day, watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. Her tiny hand reached up, barely touching the back of his palm. At first, she didn't speak. She just looked at him as if searching for something she hadn't yet learned the words to ask. Then, in a whisper that carried more weight than any shout in that room, she said, "Thank you." Elijah crouched down, meeting her at eye level. He didn't correct her. He didn't deflect the emotion. He just looked at her with a softness that hadn't shown itself all trial long, and he whispered, "You already matter." She blinked, and something in her shoulders relaxed, like maybe for the first time she believed it. And in that moment, every adult in that room understood what they had failed to do, see? As Elijah turned again toward the exit, his gaze briefly passed over Judge Greeley. Their eyes met only for a second. But in that second, Greeley's posture shifted ever so slightly. Not guilt, not contrition, just recognition. The kind that comes too late to matter, but not too late to feel. Travis stood frozen near the back. his badge still clipped to his chest, but no longer worn with confidence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence now wasn't dominance, it was retreat. And still Elijah said nothing to him, because forgiveness doesn't always arrive with a speech. Sometimes it's just walking past someone and choosing not to look back. The doors opened, light spilled in warm, steady indifferent to the failures of the walls behind it. As Elijah stepped into that light, the air outside felt cleaner, not because the world had changed, but because someone had walked through its worst and refused to bow. Some in the courtroom remained seated as if waiting for a cue that never came. Others stood unsure of whether they were witnessing an end or a beginning. Elijah didn't wait to find out. He didn't need to. Because in the story of dignity, the loudest victory is often the one where no one cheers, just listens. And that day, for the first time in far too long, the world listened. Outside the courthouse, the sky had already turned pale, the kind of color that doesn't know whether it belongs to dusk or dawn. But inside, things had never been clearer. Travis Harlan stood off to the side, stripped of his badge. No uniform, no sidearm. Just a man in a rumpled shirt blinking like he couldn't quite figure out when the world stopped obeying him. His suspension had been swift. No ceremony, no defense. The department had issued a single statement. Pending review, but everyone knew what it meant. No one came forward to speak for him, not even his own partner. He had once walked into that courtroom like a storm full of noise and accusation. Now he couldn't even look Elijah in the eye. But Elijah didn't look at him either. Not because he was angry, but because there was nothing left to see. Judge Greeley didn't return to the bench. He stepped down quietly, blending into the crowd like any other man. His robe folded over his arm, his eyes fixed on the floor. From beginning to end, he never once uttered a word of apology. He didn't ask for understanding. He didn't offer an excuse. And somehow, that said more than any speech could. There was no closure, no public reckoning, just absence. Absence where responsibility should have stood. Absence where dignity should have risen. And that silence, that unwillingness to name the wrong, was louder than anything they'd said from the bench. Days later, in a small mailbox just outside River Haven, a letter arrived. It was addressed by hand, the envelope plain, the handwriting firm. It was sent to Martha Harlan Travis's mother. Inside just one page. I forgive your son, not because he asked, and not because he deserves it. I forgive him, because silence broke mine too. No signature, no return address. Just the soft trace of a man who had been broken but chose not to break others. Elijah didn't go on a press tour. He didn't sit down with journalists or take part in rallies. He returned home quietly. Back to the small house with the front porch light he always left on just in case someone needed to find their way back. But in River Haven, things didn't return to normal, because normal had been shattered. And that was the real victory, not a courtroom win, not a viral clip, but the quiet discomfort left behind. The long, slow shift in how people looked at power, and how quickly it could turn on those who didn't wear it loud enough. Some still whispered that Elijah had overreacted. Others said the system worked eventually. But for those who sat in that courtroom, who saw the cuffs fall and the lies unravel, there was no going back. Travis had no more words, and Judge Greeley had no more robes. And maybe, just maybe, that was justice not wrapped in gold but laid bare in silence. Because sometimes the loudest confession isn't shouted. It's simply not denied. Elijah didn't rush to leave the courthouse. He walked slow, not because he was tired, but because for the first time in days no one was pushing him. No one was shouting. No one was telling him what he was supposed to be. There were no reporters crowding the stairs. No crowd waiting to cheer. Just a quiet corridor and a door that opened into the afternoon. The air outside was cool, crisp, honest. And as he stepped into it, something subtle began to happen. People didn't clap. They didn't chant his name. But one by one they stood. Not out of habit, but out of something deeper. A kind of respect that has no name, no sound, just presence. Toon Grant stood waiting a few steps beyond the marble pillars, his posture still straight, his uniform sharp, but his eyes softer than they'd been inside the courtroom. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his hand in salute. Elijah didn't return the gesture. He didn't need to. Instead, he placed his hand over his chest, slow and steady. Not as a soldier, not as a defendant, but as a man who knew what it meant to carry something heavier than any uniform could ever show. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, not in awe, but in recognition, because justice hadn't come in a speech or a verdict. It had come in the way a man walked out of a room that tried to erase him still whole. The story didn't end there. It never really does. But no one watching that day would forget what they'd seen. They wouldn't forget the man who was judged, not by what he said, but by what he didn't. They wouldn't forget the system that blinked first, not because it saw truth, but because it couldn't deny it any longer. And they wouldn't forget the silence. Not the silence of fear or defeat, but the kind that makes people stop and think. He walked in chains. He walked out in silence. But today it wasn't him on trial. It was the system that failed to see him. And this time, everyone did. Some stories don't need to shout to be heard. Elijah Cross didn't walk out of that courtroom a hero. He walked out a human being undeniably seen, quietly dignified, and finally free from the weight of silence. This story reminds us that justice isn't just about laws. It's about being recognized for who we are, beyond uniforms, beyond prejudice. It's about choosing dignity even when the world refuses to offer it. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, true-inspired tales that shine a light on the moments society tries to ignore. Your support means everything. It keeps us going. It helps us bring more voices, more truth, and more humanity to the surface. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember what others tried to forget.